Hey there, welcome back to Consolidating Power. I'm very happy to have you today to discuss the format that I wanted to dedicate this channel to really from its inception, which is the Eternal format, or the non-rotating, high-power format for Star Wars Unlimited. So we're going to cover a couple things today, the first of which is going to be the philosophy of what makes a high-power format. What are the theoretical underpinnings that make Eternal something that you're going to be excited to play, or might not be your cup of tea. Because I can tell you right now that Eternal is going to feel completely different. It's going to sort of operate on a different paradigm entirely for what the game is going to represent and what it's going to feel like. And it's not for everybody, but it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be a new way to play the game. So after that, I'm going to actually talk about my experience playing a high power format in another card game. This is going to be Magic, the modern format in Magic. And if you're not interested in hearing about Magic at all, you don't want to see any Magic cards, feel free to skip past that. But I think some of my experiences there about what made modern exciting to me might translate well into what we could maybe expect for Star Wars Unlimited's Eternal format. Then I'll briefly talk about some of the possibilities that Eternal might have in the game in terms of how Fantasy Flight could support it. And then finally, I'm just briefly going to leave off with some speculation of what some high power leaders might be and some cards to look out for. But I'm not dedicating this video to those. I'm probably going to do some future videos on them. But we'll do a little teaser at the end of what those might look like. But for the most part, this video is going to be dedicated to discussing the philosophy of Eternal and what it might look like in Star Wars Unlimited. All right, so the first thing about a non-rotating format. Again, just to stress, in February, when we get set 7, sets 1, 2, and 3 will no longer be legal in Premiere. When that happens, we're going to now have two formats. Premiere, which is only sets 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on until those rotate, and Eternal, which is all sets. And the first thing here is that Eternal lets you do is use all of your cards. Um, Let's think about what's come out in set 1, especially, that has sort of been foundational to the game. Cards like Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker, Resupply, Overwhelming Barrage, Force Throw, any of these sort of foundational cards to what it feels like to play Star Wars. You're going to be able to use those forever, eternally, in this format. And that's exciting to those of us who don't want to stop playing the leaders that we like, stop using the shiny cards that we've spent a lot of money on collecting, right? So you're going to be able to use all of those cards in this format, and this is great for people who have collected the game since set 1. On the other hand, though, the interesting thing about Eternal is that the values of these cards that rotate out is going to fluctuate wildly. And I won't spend too much time talking about it in this video. This might be a topic for the future. But some cards that are going to be Eternal staples are going to hold their value from here on because they're likely not going to be reprinted. I don't want to speculate on what's going to be reprinted and not here, but let's just imagine that Luke Skywalker never gets reprinted, and he remains the most powerful blue-white card in the game. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but let's keep that in mind. Let's say they never reprint it. In 10 years, since there's only a finite amount of Lukes in the world, that value is going to go up because he's going to be played in Eternal. Now, on the other hand, 95% of other cards will not make the cut of the power level required to play Eternal, meaning that they are going to be very cheap. So if you want to get started in Eternal, and this again I think I'll dedicate for the future, if you want to get started in Eternal, you can play actually a cheaper or weaker version of what we might call a tier 1 deck in Eternal, because the cards will be so cheap, since they're not played in Premiere anymore, but they're also not at the S tier. The next thing to discuss here is possible issues with rotation with regards to Eternal and Premiere. See, when sets 1, 2, and 3 rotate out, we're losing a lot of the what we might call the good cards in the game. And when we look ahead to what the game might look like with sets 4 or 5 and what we're beginning to see of 6, we're losing. What are we going to have? What is the game going to look like? Because right now, with piloting and the Force, which are two mechanics I'm not the biggest fan of, are all the decks just going to become this two ships passing each other in the night, these big battle cruiser formats where there's not much interaction? We've got the Force decks on the ground, we got the space decks in space, and that's it. And if that becomes the game after rotation, I think Eternal is going to feel better. Speaking of how the game is going to be after rotation, Eternal will feel incredibly different. It's going to feel extremely broken in some ways. Some of us are very excited for that, and I want to try when I discuss Magic in the next segment. I want to try and get across this feeling that busted isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, quote The Incredibles: if everyone's super, no one is. And if we think about that, if all the decks are so broken that in some ways that has a sort of balancing effect against it. Now, I've put a little GIF from Dave Chappelle here, the peanut butter and crack sandwich, and I want to ask you: have you had your peanut butter and crack sandwich experience in this game yet? For some of us, I'm just going to use triple dark raid here. I loved TDRing out Devastator. The green Devastator, I played it in Palpatine, but I'm sure Django players feel the same way, or TDRing out War Juggernaut. It just felt incredible, and you got sort of addicted to the gambling high of TDRing something, right? For me, that was my peanut butter and crack sandwich, and I tried to shove Triple Dark Raid in any deck I could and see if we could break it. For some people, that might be the Tech DJ combo and Han. When you played it, you felt incredible. Maybe Sabine players liked the in set 2, the ECL Wrecker was their peanut butter and crack sandwich, right? You just want to do that thing every single game. Maybe you haven't had yours yet, but Eternal might be the place for you to discover it. Because when we have an incredibly sort of broken mechanic, tactic, line of play, you feel on top of the world. And Eternal is going to be the place to discover this because all the cards are going to be available for you to do that. Okay, the next thing is that in Eternal there is going to be a pretty defined meta. And by this I mean we're not going to see a huge range of decks. Yep, there's going to be a lot of Boba, there's going to be a lot of Django, and there's going to be both Hans. In fact, later on, I think these are going to be the S tier leaders, and that might not be very exciting for you. Maybe you hate Boba, maybe you hate playing against Django, and that's okay. That's okay if you hate playing against them, because let me first say that Eternal won't be for everyone. That's not a bad thing. You, we have Premiere for a reason. We have other formats. We've got Twin Suns. We're going to have Trilogy. If it gets supported, we have Limited. Different formats for different people is not a bad thing. It allows people to find their niche, right? And Eternal will cluster around a few archetypes, a few leaders, because the bar for being a good deck is very, very high in Eternal. Again, I want to stress that if you don't want to see a lot of Bobas and Djangos, that's okay. You don't have to play it. But what I think this actually does is maybe you should consider having two decks. Maybe you have a Premier deck, and maybe you have an Eternal deck. And I'll talk about this a bit later, but when we're thinking about how Fantasy Flight is going to support Eternal, it's very likely that they're going to have tournaments running at the same time that have both Eternal and Premier events. Because maybe you're not the happiest with Premier at a certain time, so you decide to play Eternal for this tournament season. Or vice versa. Maybe you were just so sick of seeing Django tap down your entire board, you go back to Premier. But I don't think having a defined meta like this is a bad thing. And what it also allows you to do as a deck builder is really clean up your silver bullets for these enemy decks. you are going to memorize what the play lines against Boba Green ECL is going to be, or Django Tarkentown, or Han 2 Yellow, well, not Han 2 Yellow, Han 1 Yellow. You're going to memorize these decks, and you're going to memorize how to beat them. And the real innovation in Eternal is going to come from how you choose to load up your silver bullets, I think. So here I want to take a look at three formats of Magic. Now, all the way on the left, we have Legacy and Vintage, which is Magic's an old game. It's 30 years old. And there are some very, very broken, very, very expensive cards from 30 years ago, like Black Lotus here, that can only be played in these formats that have everything. And I do mean everything, with a few exceptions. Now, Legacy and Vintage, if you go look up how much one of these decks costs, it's like $20,000 or more, right? Because they're using these very broken cards from 30 years ago. I'm going to go ahead and say that I don't think Star Wars will ever get to the point where they need to have a format like this. But let's say they ban Boba and Django also in Eternal. Maybe in 15 years they'll have a very unlimited format which you can then use Boba and Django in. That might be the equivalent. But the format I'm going to talk about today is Modern, and I think that's going to be more equivalent to Eternal. And what Modern is in Magic is it's, well, modern cards. Modern being a relative term, where it started to use the new frames that you see on the Magic cards here. They look like this on the right and not like this on the left. And it was sort of a power shift, but you can use any of the cards, I think, in the last like 15, 20 years in Modern, but not the most recent cards, which is what Standard is. And Standard is almost one-for-one equivalent to Premier in Star Wars Unlimited. In Magic, they can use Spider-Man and whatever else this Universes Beyond nonsense is, but there it is. So let's focus on these two formats on the right here. We've got Modern, our high-power, non-rotating format, and we've got Standard, our rotating format, kind of like Premier. Okay, I want to talk a little about playing Modern and Magic. So one of my friends in Surrey, shout out to them when I was playing Magic a couple years ago, wanted to play Modern alongside Commander, Commander being sort of like Twin Suns. I wasn't interested. I wasn't interested in trying out a high power format. First of all, because it was expensive. I didn't want to spend hundreds of pounds buying these expensive resources called lands and Magic. I didn't want to have the game end on turn 4. I didn't all of these, I think, valid concerns that people that see these decks that cost $20,000 be like, no, no thanks. But my friend let me borrow one of his Modern decks, and I sat down to play it, and I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. And of course, I got sucked in from there. So I want to talk about just some cards from Magic. You don't need to know how to play Magic here. I'm just going to talk about kind of what these cards are doing that is a little bit broken, a little bit interesting for Modern and Magic, but these kind of design concepts that we can apply to Star Wars. So the deck that my friend James handed me was called Death's Shadow, and you'll see this unit here, a creature, Death Shadow on the left here, which cost 1, and it's a 13/13. But Death Shadow says it gets -X, where X is how much damage is on your base, essentially. In Magic, it works the opposite of Star Wars, where instead of starting at 0, they start at 20, and then they go down from there. So with 20 health, if you played this on turn 1, it would just die, because it would be a -7, -7. But the whole goal of this deck is to do damage to yourself so that it becomes very big. And I'm like, well, it's going to take forever, though. It's going to take like 4 or 5 turns to start doing damage to yourself for this to matter. Well, not in Modern. So I'm going to point out the card that I drew in my opening hand, which is Street Wraith here. And I was like, I'm not understanding this deck. And then when I saw this card, it all fell into place immediately. And I was like, oh, okay, this format's kind of cool, kind of crazy. So Street Wraith here is a 5-cost 3/4. And how are you playing this on turn 1? Well, if you look at this, there's an ability called Cycling on it, which says pay 2 life, sort of like do 2 damage to your base, to discard this card and draw a card. This is free. It costs no resources. So you get to do 2 damage to yourself, discard this, and draw a card. And I'm like, oh man, we're already at 18. Okay, things are beginning to cook. So then you discard the Street Wraith for free, draw a card, maybe you draw another one, you do that for free. You play these lands that let you do damage to yourself for free, and then all of a sudden, on like turn 1, you might have already taken 7 damage, right? Then we've got this zombie fish on the right, which is a 7 cost 5/5, and you're like, why do you keep saying these expensive cards? Well, this has an ability that says for every card in your discard pile that you remove from the game, it costs 1 cheaper. So if you start to discard Street Wraith and you just start to put these lands that do damage to you into your discard pile, well, suddenly on turn 1, you might have 4 cards in your discard pile. And you can play this 5/5 out, maybe even by turn 2, maybe sooner. But the whole goal of this deck is to get these giant creatures out really early by doing damage to yourself. And this is just not really possible in Premier or Standard in Magic because all of these cards are coming from sets that are years apart. And you'll notice that these cards on the right, Street Wraith and Gurmag Angler, are commons. And this is an interesting thing to say about high power formats, is that suddenly commons can just be busted. Really, really powerful when you have 15 years worth of cards to draw on. And I think that's kind of exciting, is you got to go dig up your old commons from 10 years ago to build a new deck. Okay, so then I want to talk about what I ended up playing in Modern, which is a deck called Ponza. Now, actually, the cards I'm going to show you here are from a different version of the deck I played in a format called Pauper, which was commons only, but you could play a deck pretty similar to this in Modern, and I had a lot of fun with it. So Ponza is apparently an old term from the old Magic days, like 20 years ago, which means deep fried pizza. And the whole goal of the deck is to turn your opponent's resources into deep fried pizza. And so that's what Stone Rain here in the middle does. It says destroy target land for 3. And yeah, it's kind of degenerate. It's sort of like DJ, but only one-sided. And well, there's people like me out here who like to do these things. Yeah, you can flame me in the comments if you think this sounds awful. But what the whole goal of the deck was, I suspect we might see something like this in Star Wars Unlimited at some point, is you ramp, and here I have an elf on the left, which you can play on turn 1. It taps to make a resource for you, and I'm looking forward to the day that we get some elves in Star Wars because I think we need some turn 1 ramp, honestly. So turn 1 you ramp, turn 2 you play a card like Stone Rain and destroy your opponent's resources so that they're now behind, and then you keep ramping, and then finally you drop a big dinosaur on the right. So you ramp, you destroy their lands to put them behind, and you drop a big dinosaur. And I think we actually have a similar deck to this already in Star Wars Unlimited, which is Admiral Piet. And let me tell you, if Piet starts to get some resource destruction and starts to ramp a little bit early, I think this is going to be an interesting archetype, especially because it's very counterable, right? You just kill their big dinosaur. But I think it was a fun format, a fun deck to play in the format, and I hope we see something like this. But we haven't seen anything like this. And again, I want to stress this is where in a legacy format like Eternal, we might see exciting new strategies. Okay, the next deck I want to show you here is something called Belcher, or Goblin Char Belcher combo. And this is another deck I played in Modern. And we have nothing like this in Star Wars Unlimited yet. What we might call a really broken sort of infinite combo. This one's not technically infinite, but the closest thing we have to an infinite combo in Star Wars Unlimited is the Admiral Trench, Sand Hill, Admiral Body combo, which takes like 12 resources and they have to do nothing, and you're already winning the game at that point if you can manage to get that off. But this deck is really unique, and we don't really have any combo decks like this in Star Wars because we don't have ways to really break the game like this yet in Star Wars. And I'm looking forward to when we do, because I will play a deck like this. So what Goblin Charbelcher does, I don't want to read all the text on these cards, but what it says is reveal cards from your deck until you reveal a land. And when you do, you're going to deal damage equal to the number of cards you revealed. So what you do is you put no lands in the deck, and lands are like resources that you have to play in Magic, right? Well, how do you even play this card then if you can't put lands in your deck, if you can't put resources in your deck? Well, you'll run this other card that Magic released. They have a couple of these, which are events on the front and lands on the back. And in Magic, they only count what the front side of the card is. So you're not running any lands in the deck, right? So when you activate Goblin Charbelcher, you just flip over your whole deck, which is like 50 cards at this point, 40, 50 cards. There's no lands in it, so you just do 40, 50 damage to your opponent's base. That's not really how Magic was intended to be played, but it's a way to sort of interact with the game in a new way. This might sound very broken, but I promise you it's not. All you have to do is just destroy this Goblin Charbelcher thing or counter it. But it's an interesting strategy. Okay, but let's talk about something a little more degenerate. When I was playing Modern, there was a deck called Rakdos Scam, and this was the most hated deck in the format for very good reason. It was very, very degenerate. And one of the two main cards in this deck that just made it broken were called Grief and Fury. Grief. Shout out to Grief Karga. You know, the Bendu boys, some friends of mine in London, they love Grief Karga, so but let me tell you, this is not a Grief Karga card. This is infinitely worse. So Grief and Fury here are essentially play Spark or Rebellion for free on turn one, and play Fury, or I'm sorry, play Overwhelming Barrage for free on turn one. Can you imagine Star Wars playing Spark Rebellion and Overwhelming Barrage for free on turn one? Yeah, it's a lot. And so what happens here, how these cards became so broken, is we have this ability called Evoke, which says exile a black card from your hand, exile a red card from your hand. And what these are, this is exactly the same effect as Bamboozle, which allows you to discard a yellow card to play the card for free. Um, Now, the thing is that you can also still play these cards as units later in the game to have the same abilities. I mean, it was nuts. But I bring up these cards because their ability to have very powerful effects for free. And I think Wu has made a whole video, or at least he's talked a lot about Bamboozle being a game-breaking card because of its ability to sort of completely destroy the piloting mechanic in the game and for doing it for free. And this is kind of the closest comparison we have to Grief and Fury here is Bamboozle. And I suspect if we ever see more free cards like Bamboozle in Eternal, these will be staple events that the play lines of the game are going to be based around. So expect to see a lot of Bamboozle. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about, I want to go through pretty quickly here, but it's just what could they possibly do with the Eternal format? And the first thing I think that we're going to do is we're going to see tournaments for it, especially at the Galactic Championship in Las Vegas next year. Now, I don't think it's going to be held at the same scale as Premier, at least to start with in the first year. And who would even play in a tournament for Eternal? And it all comes down to prize support, right? Now, if they get cash out as a prize, obviously, I think people would play it then. But where I would like to see some prize support is to see new treatments of cards that have rotated, of eternal cards, essentially, right? I mean, I would love if they did a sort of most wanted kind of bounty frame for all the cards that have been banned in Premiere, right? Like if you gave me a prestige version of Triple Dark Raid, I would lose my mind and I would do anything I could to win the Eternal format. I'll play the most meta thing possible, right? But give us a prestige DJ, prestige Boba and Django with, sort of this cool bounty poster frame on it. I think that would be fantastic, and it would encourage at least me to play the format. I don't know about you guys, but drop in the comments what you would like to see them support with prizes for Eternal. The next thing is going to be a little controversial here, which is going to be supplemental sets. I don't know if Fantasy Flight should do this, but I want to tell you what Magic has done. Essentially, Magic releases from time to time supplemental sets for different formats. Right now, we only have one set of cards, which is the premier sets that release every 3 months, or 3 or 4 months, right? 3 sets a year. Magic also releases other sets that are not legal in Standard, but that are legal in formats like Modern or Commander, that you can play in limited environments, right? And for Modern, these are called the Modern Horizon sets, which are often infamous for how expensive and how broken they are. But they are often define the Modern set and often break sets formats like Commander because the cards are so powerful. I don't want to write it off, but I wouldn't be surprised if once a year we begin to see a small supplemental set like this. We've already had the Hoth starter set, right, which was not powerful at all. There's probably only 2 cards in there that are going to see me play. But if they start to release sets like this that could operate as a legal in Eternal, legal in Twin Suns type format, we could see some defining come from this. The thing I want to say about Modern Horizons is that they often reprinted old cards in that set at new rarities. So stuff like Luke. Can you imagine if Luke was reprinted in about 5 years in a supplemental set, not legal in Premier, but at a lower rarity, at like rare, that had new treatments, new frames, new foiling for the Luke? I mean, I think people would buy it, is the thing. But the real criticism that Wizards of the Coast gets from Magic about Modern Horizon sets is that they overcharge for them. They overcharge for them substantially. Um, but just I want to give one positive thing about the Modern Horizon sets is that they were amazing draft environments. They were in fact incredible for draft and sealed because they were so high power and they felt like a lot of fun, very bomby, very explosive. And that could be fun. I would love to do a high power draft for Star Wars in the future. So I don't know. Again, you can drop in the comments if you think that something like this should never come to it. I'm not saying it should, but I wouldn't throw it under the bus entirely. If FFG wants to make money and they release prestige versions of old cards, in 5 years, I mean, I wouldn't put it past them. And just very briefly on bans, I might have said it earlier in this video that I think bans should have a very, very light touch. The only reason that Eternal should get any bans is if something is completely dominant. As in, if we start playing Eternal, and in 6 months and a year, 95% of the decks are Django, then yeah, Django should probably go and be moved to a even more non-rotating format like the Legacy that we discussed for Magic. But I think the ban should have a very light touch. We need to see how things shake out and let people play powerful cards, right? Let the decks be broken because again, if everything's broken, nothing is. That's kind of the mentality that I want people to get into the headspace for when you play Eternal. Okay, so I know the video is getting a bit long here, so I'm going to try and move through these last bits a little quickly because I'm not going to really dedicate the video to talking about speculating on new leaders and new cards. But let's just think about how to evaluate new leaders as they come out and whether they will be playable in Eternal. Playable in Premier, playable in Limited. These are already questions that people ask, right? And some leaders are meant for Limited. Some leaders are meant for Premier. But the bar for playability is going to be so much higher in Eternal because of, well, cards like Bamboozle, other cheap removal we might get, like Force Throw, and we really have to think about what is going to make these cards playable. And I've sort of divided it into 3 categories here. That I think a leader is going to need one of these 3 things to be playable at all in Eternal. Do they generate resources? Do they generate cards? Or do they have some form of built-in control? And I think the leaders have to have one of these 3 things to be playable at all. Now let's look at the most powerful leaders in the game. So Boba Fett and Jango Fett, they're banned. Why are they banned? Well, Boba's overstated, and he generates resources, right? Django, he's banned because not only is he sort of overstated, he's got the good 3/7 threshold that Quinlan and everyone else has, but he has built-in control that kind of broke Premier, as we know. And then Han and Han, they're not banned, but they're very powerful, right? And they both give you some sort of resource advantage. And I think these four leaders are going to be the S tier leaders that are immediately going to see play in Eternal and going to be sort of defining the game from there. And it's sort of thematic, right? Boba versus Han, Empire Strikes Back. Come on. Now, let's look at a new leader that was just announced for Set 6 and why I think Dedra from Andor, amazing, why she might be a consideration for Eternal. I'm not immediately saying that she is playable, but when we look at her ability, which is, does a I am your father, or in this case, I'm your mommy effect, very funny, FFG, you know, she has a built-in I am your father effect to either do damage, control, or draw a card. And this is both card advantage and control. And it's when we have that option available to you, it's worth considering. So think about that as we see the rest of the set six reveals. Are any of these leaders doing one of these three things? They might be worth keeping an eye on in the future. Let's talk about the same thing, but with cards. What is the threshold for a card to be playable in Eternal? Or rather, archetype defining in Eternal? Earlier I said that these leaders, these four leaders, are really going to define the game because of how they play things. I mean, it's probably what? Boba Green, Django Tarkentown, Han Yellow, and then Han Blue, 2 Blue Force, right? These are going to be the main archetypes from here on, I speculate. And what allows cards to be playable in them? And the answer is it really depends. But let's see what commonalities some of the more broken cards in the game have. And the first is that the cards are undercosted, like Force Throw. Force Throw costs 1, or especially free cards. I mentioned earlier the Grief Fury being very similar to Bamboozle. I think Bamboozle is going to be a very played card in Eternal for that reason. The next thing is, does the card interact with the game in a unique way, or does it disable a part of the game in a unique way? The first thing we can think about is DJ. The DJ interaction with Han is inherently broken, and it interacts with the game in a unique way. The fact that Han steals the resource, destroys it, and he's ramped and is deramped you. That is a unique effect that is inherently broken. It's also a card that generates resource advantage in some way. Now, another card that does this is Triple Dark Raid. Not only is the card enter ready, not only is the card cheaper, not only does it go back to your hand, it generates so much value that it is worth looking at. Now, we don't have any cards that are generating pure resource value yet, except something like the Sand Hill Trench Admiral Mahdi combo. But when we ever get a way to maybe untap something and then make more resources out of it, that is going to be worth looking at because it's going to lead to generating a huge resource advantage, which will allow you to do some sort of broken combo. The other thing to say about units, the units that are going to be played in Eternal, 90% of them are going to need when played abilities. Otherwise, they're not worth running. If they're going to be on attack abilities, well, they're going to have to be comboed with something that allows them to get a when played straight off. So something like Energy Conversion Lab is going to be okay with an on attack ability. But pretty much any other card is just not going to see play because the level of interaction with them, like Force Throw and other cheap interaction we get in the future, is going to be so high that these units won't get attacks off as much as you would like. Turn ones might be the exception here, but the bar for good turn ones will continue to increase as power creep increases as cards get released. And then just anything that's just broken. Any card that gets banned in Premiere is going to have a home in Eternal. Okay, so I'll sort of end here with some examples of cards to keep an eye on. Now, these are not all the good cards in the game, obviously, but these are just stuff that stood out to me, and I'm probably going to do a video in the future about more cards to keep an eye on. But let's just talk briefly about Lurking TIE Phantom and Chewbacca. Now, you know how I said the units need a when played effect to be playable? Here's some exceptions. Lurking TIE and Chewbacca will be played in Eternal because they dodge removal. And if we get more abilities like this, decks that rely on aggroing your opponent out will be built on the backs of cards like these that are able to get around removal. To that end, another card that I don't think anyone's talked about, but I do think will play in a deck of some sort in Eternal, is Kylo Ren's lightsaber here, because it allows a unit to dodge a form of removal. Now, oh, this unit can't be exhausted by enemy card abilities. That's not all the types of removal, but we need to think that Django is going to be one of the top 4 decks in Eternal. And when we see a card like Kylo Ren's Lightsaber, that probably isn't going to be played in Premier. But if we bring this over to Eternal, this might see play as a way to counter Django, especially if you're relying on units to close the game. You slap this on your Force unit, and suddenly Django can't tap it down. That is a win con for you. So go through the card database sometime and just think about stuff that, well, this wasn't the right, environment for this card. But what is the right environment for this card? It might be in Eternal, and this is a good example of a card that might see play in the future. I've already talked a lot about Bamboozle here, so let's just go ahead and move on. Okay, and with that, I think that wraps everything up. So the next video I want to release is probably going to be a tier list of the playable leaders in Eternal. And this is probably going to be pretty heartbreaking. There's going to be a lot of hurt feelings because, let me tell you, the bar is really high for these leaders to be played. So don't expect Finn to be on there. I'm sorry. Shout out to the Bendu boys. Speaking of which, I put 2 Bendus in here just for you guys. So if you made it all the way to the end of the video, please comment that you fear the storm. You fear the storm that not only Bendu brings, but the storm of Eternal going to be in the future. So with that, thanks very much for following me here. Please subscribe and leave a comment on if you want to see more Eternal videos, because I'm really excited to keep talking about this format and seeing what high power in Star Wars is really going to represent. So thanks very much, guys, and have a good one.